Have you ever caught yourself in a moment of quiet solitude and wondered, who exactly is this person that I call myself? This peculiar entity that walks about, makes decisions, has opinions, likes certain things and dislikes others? Is there really some authentic you beneath all the layers of social conditioning, expectation and performance? Or is this whole pursuit of finding your true self perhaps the very thing keeping you trapped in a magnificent illusion? Today I want to explore with you what might be one of the most fascinating puzzles of human existence, this burning desire to know who we really are, to be authentic, genuine, and true to ourselves. And yet the harder we look for this elusive, authentic self, the more it seems to slip through our fingers like water. What a marvelous predicament, wouldn't you agree? It's quite extraordinary, this modern fixation we have with finding our authentic self. Everywhere you turn, there's another book, another teacher, another method promising to help you discover the real you beneath all the masks. Be yourself, they say. Be authentic. As if somewhere within you there exists a solid, definable core, the real you, waiting to be uncovered like buried treasure. But I want to suggest something rather subversive. What if this desperate search for the authentic self is actually the very thing preventing you from living authentically? Isn't that a delicious paradox? You see, the moment you begin hunting for your authentic self, you've already created a division, a split between the hunter and the hunted, the seeker and the sought. You've established yourself as someone who is currently inauthentic, but who might, with enough effort and introspection, eventually become authentic. And so begins an endless quest, always reaching, always becoming, never arriving. This reminds me of the Zen story about the man riding a donkey, searching far and wide for a donkey. How absurd it would seem to others watching him. But my friend, they might say, you're already sitting on the donkey you're looking for. And so it is with our search for the authentic self. What we fail to recognize is that authenticity isn't something to be achieved through effort, but rather something that manifests naturally when we cease pretending to be something we're not. But here's the trick, and it's a marvelous one. How can you stop pretending to be something you're not if you don't know who you really are? Around and around we go. Perhaps the first step in this unusual exploration is to consider whether this authentic self we're all so desperately seeking actually exists in the way we imagine it does. Could it be that what we're looking for has no fixed form, no permanent substance? What if, instead of a solid core, our authentic nature is more like the flowing of a river, never the same from one moment to the next, yet always itself? From the moment we enter this world, we begin our apprenticeship in what I like to call the grand theater of identity. You see, none of us arrives on the stage of life knowing our lines. We learn them bit by bit from the players around us, our parents, teachers, friends, and all the colorful characters who populate our early years. Think about it as a child. You didn't know how to be you. You had to learn it. You observed how Daddy behaved when he was angry, how Mommy expressed love, how your teacher showed approval. And gradually, through this process of imitation and reinforcement, you constructed a repertoire of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that you came to identify as yourself. Isn't it fascinating? The very self you think of as most genuinely you is largely composed of borrowed gestures, adopted opinions, and rehearsed emotions. Like a method actor who has been playing the same role for so long that he's forgotten he's acting, I'm reminded of the traditional masks of the No theater in Japan. These masks are designed with such subtle craftsmanship that when the actor tilts his head in different ways, the mask appears to express completely different emotions. Tilt up slightly and the mask seems to smile. Tilt down and it appears to frown. Our personalities function in much the same way they're masks we've learned to tilt just so, depending on the situation. But here's where it gets particularly interesting. Over time, we forget that we're wearing masks at all. We become so identified with our performances that we mistake them for our essential nature. The businessman believes he really is a businessman, through and through. The mother believes motherhood is her true identity. The intellectual can't conceive of himself as anything other than a thinking being. And yet, beneath all these performances, who is the performer? Who is the one wearing all these masks? If you strip away every role you play, every title, relationship, belief, and characteristic, you identify with what remains. This is where our exploration begins to get wonderfully slippery. Let's dig a bit deeper into this curious notion of the borrowed self. I want you to take a moment and consider any opinion you hold dear. Perhaps it's a political view, a religious belief, or simply your preference for a certain type of music. Now ask yourself, is this truly your original thought? Or is it something you've absorbed from your culture, your upbringing, your education? The uncomfortable truth, and it is delightfully uncomfortable, is that very little of what we consider to be our thoughts are actually our own. They're fragments we've collected, ideas we've inherited, beliefs we've been persuaded to adopt. Even the language in which you think isn't your own creation. It was given to you, and with it came all sorts of implicit assumptions about how the world works. Consider how differently you might conceive of yourself if you'd been born in ancient China or medieval Europe or among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. The very categories through which you understand your existence would be entirely different. The line between yourself and others might be drawn in a completely different place. And it's not just our thoughts and beliefs that are borrowed. It's our desires as well. How do you know what to want? How do you know what success looks like, what happiness feels like, what love should be? These aren't innate, they're learned. You were taught what to desire, what to pursue, what to avoid. So much of what we call the self is like a collage, bits and pieces snipped from magazines, pasted together to create the illusion of a coherent picture. Your taste in clothes, influenced by your culture and peer group, your ambitions, shaped by your family's expectations and societal values, your fears, many of them inherited or learned from others' experiences. But if so much of what we consider to be ourselves is actually borrowed, what does this mean for our quest for authenticity? Is there anything left that's genuinely you? Or is the self merely a convenient fiction, a story we tell to create the comforting illusion of continuity and coherence in our lives? Now we come to one of my favorite paradoxes in this whole business of selfhood. The paradox of self-improvement. The idea that you can somehow make yourself into a better version of yourself. What an extraordinary notion. Think about it for a moment. When you embark on a journey of self-improvement, who exactly is improving whom? There seems to be a you that is doing the improving, and another you that needs to be improved. But how can you be both the improver and the one needing improvement is less than #0. 5# is greater than. It's like trying to bite your own teeth. This curious situation arises because we've accepted a fundamental premise that may not be true, that there is a solid, separate self that exists apart from everything else. This self, we believe, can be worked on, polished, perfected. But what if this premise is flawed? What if the self is not a thing at all, but rather a process, a flowing, changing current of experience that has no fixed essence? I'm reminded of the Buddhist notion of anatman, or no self. This isn't saying that you don't exist, that would be absurd. It's suggesting that you don't exist as a separate, independent entity with a fixed essence. Rather, you exist as a dynamic pattern of relationships, constantly changing, constantly in flux. From this perspective, the whole enterprise of trying to become more authentic, more yourself, begins to look rather peculiar. It's like trying to make a river more river-like. The river isn't trying to be anything, it simply flows. Its nature is to change, that is its constancy. And herein lies the great irony. The more desperately you strive to be authentic, the further you drift from true authenticity. Because authentic being isn't something you achieve through effort, it's what remains when you stop efforting altogether. It's what you are when you're not trying to be anything in particular. So perhaps the path to authenticity doesn't involve adding anything to yourself, more knowledge, more virtue, more awareness. Perhaps it involves subtraction, removing the layers of pretense, expectation, and identification that obscure your natural being. Not building yourself up, but letting yourself down. Not becoming, but unbecoming. Now, here's another fascinating wrinkle in our exploration of the authentic self, this peculiar expectation of consistency. Somehow we've come to believe that to be authentic means to be consistent. The truly authentic person, we imagine, would always be the same, reliably expressing the same preferences, holding the same values, exhibiting the same behaviors, regardless of the situation. But I want to ask you, is anything in nature consistently the same? Look at the ocean, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent. Look at the sky, sometimes clear, sometimes clouded. Look at any living creature, sometimes active, sometimes at rest. Consistency is not the way of nature, it's the way of machines. And yet we demand this mechanical consistency of ourselves and others. I thought you were the kind of person who, we say, or that's not like you, as if a person should be a fixed and predictable thing. We feel troubled, even guilty, when we find ourselves behaving differently in different contexts, playful with certain friends, serious with others, confident in some situations, hesitant in others. Which is the real me, we wonder. But what if authenticity has nothing to do with consistency? What if, on the contrary, authentic being involves a kind of intelligent responsiveness to the unique demands of each situation, is less than #0? 5# is greater than. Just as water takes the shape of whatever container it's poured into, perhaps our authentic nature flows differently, depending on the circumstances. I'm reminded of the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. It doesn't mean doing nothing, it means acting in accordance with the natural flow of things rather than imposing your will upon them. The master sailor doesn't fight the wind. He works with it, adjusting his sails according to its direction and strength. And in doing so, he's being utterly authentic, responding appropriately to what is, rather than clinging to some fixed idea of how things should be. Perhaps true authenticity, then, isn't about maintaining a consistent self-image, but about being present enough to respond genuinely to life as it unfolds. Sometimes that response might be anger, sometimes compassion, sometimes laughter, sometimes tears. The authentic person isn't afraid to be multifaceted, contradictory, unpredictable, in other words, fully human. So instead of asking, is this behavior consistent with who I think I am? Perhaps we might ask, is this behavior a genuine response to the present moment? The first question keeps us trapped in a fixed identity. The second opens us to the flowing river of authentic being. Let's venture even deeper into this peculiar puzzle of the self. Many of us, in our quest to know ourselves, adopt the position of an observer watching our own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I notice that I'm feeling angry, we might say, or I'm watching my thoughts arise and pass away. This seems like progress. We're no longer fully identified with our experiences. We have some distance, some perspective. But here we encounter another fascinating paradox. Who exactly is doing the observing? If you are observing your thoughts, then you must be something other than your thoughts. But what is this observer? Isn't it just another thought? And if so, who's observing that thought? We seem to enter an infinite regression, like those Russian dolls that contain smaller and smaller versions of themselves. It's rather like trying to see your own eyes. Your eyes can see everything except themselves. You might use a mirror, of course, but then you're not seeing your eyes directly, you're seeing a reflection of them. Similarly, whatever you observe about yourself is not your true nature, but a reflection, a representation, a model of it. This is the essential bind we find ourselves in. The self cannot be an object to itself. The knower cannot be the known. And yet we persist in this impossible task, trying to grasp our own nature as if it was something separate from the very awareness that's doing the grasping. In Zen, they call this trying to catch your own shadow. No matter how fast you run, your shadow keeps pace with you perfectly. You can never get behind it to see what it really looks like. And why? Because the shadow isn't a thing apart from you, it's an inseparable aspect of your relationship with the light. Similarly, your self isn't a thing that exists independently, waiting to be discovered. It's more like a process, a dynamic relationship between awareness and its contents. It's not something you can grasp, because the very grasping is itself an expression of what you're trying to grasp. Oh, what a marvelous puzzle it is. So perhaps the search for the authentic self isn't about finding something, but about recognizing the fundamental nature of finding itself. Not about grasping an object, but about understanding the very process of grasping. Not about knowing something, but about the nature of knowing itself. And now we arrive at what might seem at first glance to be a rather depressing conclusion. There is no solid, permanent, independent self to be found. No fixed essence that defines you once and for all. No unchanging core beneath all the layers of conditioning and performance. But wait. Before you sink into existential despair, consider this. What if this apparent absence is actually the gateway to a profound freedom? What if the discovery that there is no solid self to find is the very discovery that sets you free? You see, if there's no fixed self, then you're not bound to be any particular way. You're not constrained by a permanent essence or nature. You're free to flow, to change, to experiment, to play with different ways of being. You're not a finished product, but an ongoing process, constantly creating and recreating yourself in relationship with the world. In Buddhism, this insight is known as shunyata, often translated as emptiness or voidness. But it doesn't mean that nothing exists. It means that nothing exists in the way we normally think it does, as a separate, independent entity with its own inherent nature. Everything, including our sense of self, exists in dependence on causes and conditions, in relationship with everything else. Think of a rainbow. It appears when certain conditions come together: sunlight, moisture in the air, a particular angle of vision. It seems to have a definite location, definite colors, a definite shape. And yet if you went looking for the rainbow as a solid object, you'd never find it. It's a pattern, a relationship, a process, not a thing. And so it is with the self. The freedom of no self isn't the freedom to be whoever you want to be that's still caught in the idea of a chooser separate from what is chosen. It's the freedom to be what you already are, a fluid, responsive, ever-changing expression of the universe. Not a noun, but a verb. Not a fixed entity, but a flowing process. When you cease grasping for an authentic self, when you stop trying to define yourself, improve yourself, find yourself, something unexpected happens. The very energy that was bound up in this futile search is released, and what remains is a natural authenticity that was there all along, hidden in plain sight. Not a self that you've found, but the freedom from the need to find one at all. Now, here's something rather curious about our pursuit of authenticity. The more deliberately we try to be authentic, the less authentic we become. It's a bit like trying to be spontaneous. The very moment you decide to be spontaneous, true spontaneity has already vanished. You're caught in a peculiar bind where the conscious attempt undermines the very quality you're trying to embody. Consider the difference between calculated authenticity and genuine spontaneity. Calculated authenticity says, how should I act in order to be true to myself? It's concerned with appearances, with measuring up to some ideal of authentic behavior. It's self-conscious, effortful, and paradoxically highly inauthentic. Genuine spontaneity, on the other hand, isn't concerned with being authentic at all. It simply responds to the moment without calculation, without reference to a self-image or ideal. It's unself-conscious, effortless, and paradoxically profoundly authentic. I'm reminded of the Zen approach to archery. The beginner is very self-conscious, constantly thinking about their posture, their grip, their breathing, their aim. But the master doesn't think about these things at all. The master becomes one with the bow, the arrow, the target. There's no separation, no self-consciousness, just the flowing movement of archery itself. Similarly, true authenticity isn't achieved by constantly monitoring yourself, asking, am I being authentic now? It emerges naturally when you're so completely engaged in what you're doing that the question doesn't even arise. When you're playing music, and you are the music, when you're dancing, and you are the dance. When you're in conversation and you are the conversation. Not a separate self performing these activities, but the living activity itself. This is why children often seem so authentic to us. They haven't yet learned to be self-conscious. They don't ask themselves, how should I play in order to be true to my nature as a player? They simply play. Their laughter, their tears, their anger, their joy all arise spontaneously, without calculation or reference to a self-image. The irony is that in our pursuit of authenticity, we've become more self-conscious, more calculated, more performative, in a word, less authentic. We've lost the unself-conscious spontaneity that is the very essence of authentic being. So perhaps the path to authenticity isn't about trying to be more authentic, but about releasing the very effort to be anything at all. Not adding something to yourself, but letting go of the constant self-monitoring, self-judging, self-improving activity that keeps you separate from the spontaneous flow of life. Let me share a radical perspective with you. What if your entire life, everything you consider most serious, most important, most real, is actually a form of play? What if all your striving to be authentic is itself a kind of pretending? What if we're all engaged in an elaborate game of make-believe, but we've forgotten that it's a game? Consider how children play. A child might say, let's pretend I'm the mummy and you're the baby. And in that moment, they become fully invested in their roles. The mummy speaks in a grown-up voice, makes dinner, puts the baby to bed. The game is serious business. But at the same time, at some level, the child knows it's a game. There's a delicious double awareness being the mummy and knowing you're pretending to be the mummy both at once. As we grow older, though, we tend to lose this double awareness. We become so identified with our roles that we forget we're playing. The businessman doesn't say, let's pretend I'm a businessman. He believes he really is a businessman, through and through. The professor doesn't say, let's pretend I'm a professor. She takes her role with utmost seriousness as her real identity. But what if all our identities, all our roles, all our supposed authenticity is just as much a form of play as the child's game? What if we're all pretending all the time, but we've forgotten that we're pretending? This isn't to say that life isn't real, or that our experiences don't matter. It's to suggest that perhaps there's a way of engaging with life that combines full commitment with a light touch, like the child who is both completely immersed in being the mummy and yet knows with a wink and a nod that it's all a wonderful game. Perhaps true authenticity, then, isn't about finding your real self as opposed to your fake self. It's about recognizing that all selves are, in a sense, performances, but performances that can be engaged in with either heavy-handed seriousness or with playful delight. The Hindus have a wonderful concept for this Leela, the divine play. The idea that the entire cosmos is God's play, a grand game of hide-and-seek where the infinite consciousness pretends to be all these finite forms, all these separate selves, only to eventually remember its true nature and exclaim with delight, oh, it was me all along. So perhaps the question isn't, who am I really? But rather, how am I playing the game of being me? Am I playing it with grim determination, constantly worried about getting it right? Or am I playing it with the light touch of someone who knows it's a game serious, yes, but a game nonetheless? We've journeyed quite a distance together, haven't we? We've explored the pursuit of authenticity, the theater of identity, the borrowed self, the paradox of self-improvement, the myth of consistency, the observer and the observed, the freedom of no self, spontaneity versus calculation, and the game of pretending. And now we arrive at our final contemplation, moving beyond the very categories of authentic and inauthentic altogether. You see, as long as we're caught in the dichotomy of authentic versus inauthentic, we're still playing within the framework of a separate self that can be one or the other. We're still assuming there's a real me hiding beneath all the conditioning and performance, a genuine article waiting to be discovered or unleashed. But what if we step out of this framework entirely? What if we recognize that there's no authentic self hiding behind the inauthentic one, just as there's no real wave hiding behind the apparent wave is less than #0? 5# is greater than. The wave isn't pretending to be a wave, it's just the ocean waving. Similarly, you aren't pretending to be you, you're just the universe youing. From this perspective, the question of authenticity becomes meaningless. It's like asking whether the oak tree is being authentic when it grows toward the sunlight, or whether the river is being authentic when it flows downhill. These things simply are what they are, doing what they do, without any question of authenticity arising. And so it could be with us. Instead of striving to be authentic, we might simply allow ourselves to express whatever arises naturally in each moment, without labeling it as authentic or inauthentic, real or fake, genuine or artificial. Just this, just now, just the ongoing, ever-changing flow of experiencing itself. This doesn't mean abandoning all discernment or ethical consideration. It doesn't mean that anything goes. It means recognizing that true discernment arises naturally from clear seeing, not from measuring yourself against some ideal of authenticity. It means that ethical action flows from an understanding of interconnectedness, not from adherence to a rigid code of authentic behavior. In Zen, they speak of the state before thinking creates the division between subject and object, self and other, authentic and inauthentic. They call it ordinary mind, or original mind, not some special spiritual state, but the simple, direct experience of reality before we slice it up with our categories and judgments. Perhaps this is what true authenticity is, not a quality of a separate self, but the recognition that there is no separate self to be authentic or inauthentic. Just this moment of experiencing, complete and perfect as it is, just the universe expressing itself as you, in all your glorious particularity, without any need to be other than you are. So here we are, at the end of our exploration, although of course it isn't really an end, is it? More like a doorway, opening onto further inquiry, further discovery, further unfolding. We began by asking whether you know who you are, or have merely learned to pretend. And we've discovered something rather marvelous, that the very distinction between knowing and pretending, between being and appearing, between authentic and inauthentic, may itself be part of the grand illusion. Perhaps the most authentic thing we can do is to recognize that authenticity isn't something to be achieved, but something that manifests naturally when we cease trying to be anything in particular. Not a quality to be cultivated, but the natural expression of our being when all cultivation ceases. So I invite you to consider, what if you stopped trying to know who you are? What if you stopped trying to be authentic? What if, instead, you simply allowed yourself to be as you are in this moment, not as some fixed, definable entity, but as this flowing, changing, ungraspable process of experiencing itself? In the words of a Zen master, when hungry, eat, when tired, sleep. Simple, direct, unmediated by self-consciousness or calculation. Just this, just now. The authentic life may not be the one where you've finally discovered who you really are, but the one where the very question no longer seems relevant. And in that falling away of the question, in that release of the endless searching and striving, something unexpected may emerge, a spontaneous authenticity that was there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting only for you to stop looking for it in order to reveal itself as what you already are. Not the discovery of the authentic self, but the discovery that there is no self to be authentic or inauthentic, just the universe expressing itself as you, perfectly and completely, in this moment and this and this. And isn't that a wonder?